Sometimes we meet someone at the exact moment we need them most, when hope feels as distant as spring in the endless winter. There's something powerful about the kindness of strangers, especially when our world has crumbled and we've forgotten what safety feels like. When young Inga arrives at Eirik's door, she's running from more than just enemies. She's fleeing from a life that taught her to expect nothing but cruelty. This giant of a man, scarred by his own battles, sees her fear and makes a simple choice. Instead of turning her away, he offers shelter. When she asks to sleep in the barn, afraid to trust warmth, he says 4 words that change everything. 2 broken people find each other in the wilderness, building something beautiful from the ashes of their past lives. But will their quiet love survive when the wolves come calling? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden cross pendant pressed against Inga Frostborn's palm, its rough edges cutting into her skin as she gripped it tight enough to draw blood. The small carved piece of oak was all that remained of her father's faith, all that survived the flames that had consumed everything she'd ever known. 3 weeks of walking through wilderness had worn her down to bone and sinew. Her once bright hair now dulled with dirt and desperation. The homestead before her looked like something from a half-remembered dream. Smoke curled from the stone chimney of a sturdy longhouse, its timber walls weathered silver by countless seasons. Horse paddocks stretched in neat lines, filled with animals that moved with the easy grace of creatures well cared for. Gardens showed the careful hand of someone who understood the rhythm of seasons, who planted with hope for harvests yet to come. Inga had learned not to trust hope. Hope was what had made her father stay too long, believing the raiders wouldn't come so far north. Hope was what had killed her mother, who'd hidden in the root cellar thinking walls could stop men with axes and fire in their hearts. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford, but hunger was a different master entirely, and it had driven her past fear to this moment. Her stomach cramped with emptiness, reminding her that the last of her meager provisions had run out 2 days ago. The berries she'd found yesterday had been bitter and few, barely enough to quiet the gnawing ache that followed her every step. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze like prey, scenting a predator. A massive figure emerged from behind the largest paddock, leading a coal-black stallion that seemed to dance rather than walk. The man moved with the stallion as if they shared the same spirit, his huge hands gentle on the lead rope, despite their obvious strength. Eirik Wolfmark stood nearly a head taller than any man Inga had ever seen, his shoulders broad enough to block out the setting sun. Battle scars marked his arms like pale lightning across tanned skin, and ancient clan runes had been inked deep into his forearms in patterns that spoke of victories and losses alike. His beard, shot through with premature silver, framed a face that had seen too much of the world's cruelty, yet somehow retained a surprising gentleness around the eyes. He noticed her before she could retreat. Those storm-grey eyes, finding her across the distance with the practiced awareness of a man who'd survived by watching shadows. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply looked at each other, the broken girl and the weathered warrior, each recognizing something familiar in the other's careful stillness. "You look like you've traveled far," Eirik said, his voice carrying the rough warmth of seasoned timber. He didn't approach, didn't make any move that might spook her into running. Years of working with half-wild horses had taught him the value of patience. Inga clutched the cross tighter, feeling its edges bite deeper. "I don't want trouble," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse and thirst. I saw the smoke from your fire." "No trouble here." He secured the stallion in its paddock with movements that spoke of ritual, of tasks performed countless times with the same careful attention. "When did you last eat?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't remember feeling truly full, couldn't recall the last time food had been more than a desperate necessity grabbed between moments of terror. Her body swayed slightly, and she realized how close she was to collapse. That long, Eirik observed quietly. He studied her with the eye of someone who'd seen refugees before, who understood the hollow look of the displaced and hunted. "I got stew on the fire." "Enough for two." The offer hung in the air between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile. Inga wanted to believe it, wanted to trust the gentleness she heard in his voice. But trust was another luxury that had been burned out of her along with everything else. "I have nothing to trade," she said, the words bitter as winter wind. In her experience, kindness always came with a price, and she'd learned to distrust gifts that seemed too generous. "Did I ask for trade?" Eirik's question held no edge, only genuine curiosity. Sometimes a person just needs to eat. Sometimes that's reason enough. He turned toward the longhouse, then paused without looking back. "Doors open if you decide you're hungry enough to risk it." "I'll be inside." Inga watched him walk away, noting how he moved with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in his own skin despite his size. The longhouse door closed behind him with a soft thud that somehow managed to sound welcoming rather than final. She stood there as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, wrestling with a decision that felt larger than it should. The cross pressed against her palm, and she found herself remembering her father's voice, talking about the kindness of strangers in stories that had seemed naive even then. The smell of cooking meat drifted on the evening breeze, making her stomach clench with need. She could hear movement inside the longhouse, the comfortable sounds of someone going about their evening routine. No urgency, no impatience, just the quiet confidence of a man who'd made an offer and was content to let her choose. The first stars appeared as she finally forced her feet to move toward the door. Each step felt like a small victory over the fear that had become her constant companion. The threshold loomed before her, marking the boundary between the wilderness that had been her world and whatever lay beyond. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the partially open door, she could see firelight dancing across timber walls lined with well-made tools and weapons. A pot hung over the flames, steam rising from whatever simmered within. The man, Eirik, sat at a rough wooden table, methodically sharpening a knife with the same patience he'd shown with the horse. "Come in," he said without looking up. "Food's ready when you are." The warmth hit her as soon as she stepped inside, wrapping around her like an embrace she'd forgotten she needed. The longhouse was larger than it had appeared from outside, with sleeping alcoves built into the walls and storage areas that spoke of careful planning. Everything was clean and well-maintained, the home of someone who took pride in his surroundings. Eirik gestured to a chair across from him, still focused on his blade. "Bowls are on the shelf there. Help yourself." The stew was rich with meat and root vegetables, seasoned with herbs that made her mouth water despite her caution. She served herself a modest portion, afraid to seem greedy, then sat carefully on the edge of the indicated chair. The first spoonful hit her empty stomach like a blessing. The second brought tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with the food's heat. By the third, she was fighting not to gulp it down like a starving animal. "Slow," Eirik advised gently, still working on his knife. "Your stomach will rebel if you rush it." She forced herself to eat with deliberate care, each bite a small act of faith. The warmth spread through her body, chasing away the constant chill that had become so familiar. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be warm. "What's your name?" he asked when she'd eaten half the bowl. "Inga," she replied, the word feeling strange after so many days of silence. "Inga Frostborn. Good name. Strong." He set down the knife and looked at her properly for the first time since she'd entered. "I'm Eirik. This is my land." "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. There was something peaceful about this place, something that spoke of safety and careful tending. "The horses, they look well cared for." His smile was brief but genuine. "They're good animals, honest. They don't lie or scheme or pretend to be something they're not." The words carried weight, hinting at experiences that had taught him to value honesty above other virtues. Inga recognized the sentiment. In her short life, she'd learned that people often wore masks, that kindness could be a trap, and cruelty often hid behind pleasant faces. As the evening wore on and her hunger finally quieted, exhaustion began to claim her. The warmth, the food, the simple fact of being inside walls again, It all combined to make her realize just how bone-deep tired she truly was. "I should go," she said, rising unsteadily. "Find somewhere to sleep." "Where?" Eirik's question was practical, without judgment. "Nearest settlement is 3 days' walk, and there are wolves in these woods. They hunt in packs this close to winter." The thought of facing the darkness again, of finding some cold shelter among the trees, made her want to weep. But staying meant trusting, and trust was a wound that hadn't healed. "I'll sleep in the barn," she said quietly, clutching her father's cross until its edges cut her palm. "I won't be any trouble." Eirik was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those storm-grey eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute certainty of stone. "You'll sleep next to me." The words hit Inga like a physical blow, sending her stumbling backward until her spine pressed against the timber wall. Her breathing turned shallow and quick, the careful calm she'd maintained throughout the meal shattering like ice under a hammer. The wooden cross pendant bit deeper into her palm as her grip tightened reflexively. "No," she whispered. Then louder, "No, I can't, I won't." Eirik remained seated. His massive frame relaxed in the chair, but his eyes sharpened with understanding. He'd seen that look before, that particular terror, that had nothing to do with physical fear, and everything to do with memories that cut deeper than any blade. "Easy," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle firmness he used with spooked horses. "I'm not demanding anything from you. I'm offering protection," but Inga was beyond hearing the distinction. The walls of the longhouse seemed to close in around her, and suddenly she was 12 years old again, hiding in the grain cellar while her mother's screams echoed through their burning home. She remembered the raiders' laughter, the way they'd spoken of women like objects to be claimed and used. "I said I'd stay in the barn," she managed through chattering teeth. "That's all I need. Just somewhere the wind won't reach." Eirik studied her carefully, noting the way her free hand had moved instinctively to cover her throat, how she'd positioned herself near the door despite her exhaustion. These weren't the reactions of simple modesty. This was the behavior of someone who'd learned to fear what men could take from women. "The barn has gaps in the walls," he said quietly. "Temperature will drop below freezing tonight. You'd be dead by morning. Then I'll find somewhere else." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with a desperation that revealed more than she wanted to show. "I've managed this long on my own. Have you?" The question was gentle but pointed. "Because from where I sit, you look like someone who's been running on nothing but fear and stubbornness for weeks. How much longer do you think that will carry you?" The truth of his words stung, because she'd been asking herself the same question every day. Her body was failing her, worn down by constant travel and irregular meals. Soon the snows would come, and she had no plan beyond the vague hope of reaching some distant settlement that might take in a stranger with nothing to offer. "What do you want from me?" she asked, the question raw with exhaustion and old pain. "Men don't offer shelter for nothing. They always want something." Eirik was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped loosely on the table before him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of lived experience and hard-won wisdom. "I had a sister once," he said. "Astrid. She was about your age when the raids came to our settlement. Her father and I were away trading horses, left her with neighbors we thought we could trust." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "When we returned, she was gone, taken. We followed the raiders' trail for 3 weeks before we found what was left of their camp." Inga's breathing began to slow, despite herself, caught by the pain she heard beneath his carefully controlled words. "She was alive when we found her," Eirik continued. "Barely, broken in ways that went deeper than bones and flesh. She lived another month after we brought her home, but the girl we'd left behind was gone. In her place was someone who flinched at shadows and couldn't bear to be touched, even by those who loved her." The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. Inga found herself studying this man's face, seeing past the scars and weathered features to something softer underneath. The pain in his eyes was old but genuine, the kind that never fully healed. "I swore an oath over her grave," he said, "that I would never stand by while someone else suffered what she endured." that any woman who came to my door seeking safety would find it, with no price demanded and no conditions attached. But I said you'd sleep next to me." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "In the sleeping alcove by the fire, where you'll stay warm, and I can hear if anyone approaches the house. There's a curtain for privacy, locks on the inside if it makes you feel safer. I'll sleep on the far side of the main room, close enough to protect you, but far enough away that you need never fear me." The iron brazier in the corner held Astrid's memory like a sacred flame. Eirik had told her, though he hadn't shared that detail. The ornate metalwork was his own creation, forged in the weeks after his sister's death when his grief needed an outlet that wouldn't destroy him. It burned constantly now, a reminder of his oath and a beacon for anyone who might need the sanctuary he'd sworn to provide. Inga stared at the alcove he'd indicated, noting the thick furs that lined the sleeping space, the way the firelight would reach it throughout the night. It looked warm and safe, more comfortable than anywhere she'd slept since fleeing her burned home. But comfort was dangerous. Comfort made you soft, made you careless. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked, hating how young and frightened she sounded. "How do I know this isn't just a different kind of trap?" Eirik rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He walked to a wooden chest near the far wall and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. When he unfolded it, Inga saw a woman's dress, finely made, but showing signs of careful mending. "This was Astrid's," he said. "I keep it to remember what I failed to protect. Every woman who's stayed here since has worn it if she needed clothes, slept in that alcove if she needed safety. 7 in the past 5 years. 3 stayed for weeks, 2 for months. One made this her home for nearly a year before she felt strong enough to travel on." He refolded the dress with the same careful attention he'd shown when sharpening his knife. "All of them left whole and unharmed, with supplies and safe passage to wherever they wished to go. That's my oath, Inga Frostborn. That's the truth you're asking me to prove." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the possibility that safety could exist without a price. But fear was a hard master to serve, and it whispered of all the ways kindness could be counterfeit. "The locks," she said finally. "You said there are locks, iron bolts forged by my own hand. They lock from the inside, and I have no key that overrides them. Once you draw those bolts, nothing enters that alcove unless you choose to open them." The brazier flickered as a draught touched the flames, sending dancing shadows across the walls. Inga watched the play of light and dark, thinking of all the cold nights that lay ahead, all the empty roads and hostile strangers she'd have to face if she walked back into the wilderness. "If I stay," she said slowly, "what happens in the morning?" "You eat breakfast," Eirik replied. "You rest if you need to. You decide what comes next. No obligations, no debts to repay. You're free to leave whenever you choose, with whatever supplies you need for the journey." The simplicity of it was almost harder to believe than elaborate lies would have been. In her experience, men always wanted something: obedience, service, payment in coin or flesh. The idea that someone might offer sanctuary without expecting anything in return seemed too good to be real. But the alternative was the barn, with its gaps and drafts and the promise of a slow death by freezing. Or worse, returning to the roads where other travelers might not be bound by oaths to dead sisters. "The curtain," she said. "And the locks." "Both," he confirmed. "And my word that I'll not disturb your rest unless the house itself is under attack." Inga closed her eyes and tried to imagine feeling safe enough to sleep deeply. To rest, without one ear always listening for approaching footsteps. The concept seemed as foreign as speaking a language she'd never learned. "All right," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his steady gaze. "One night." "Just to get warm again." Eirik nodded, as if she'd agreed to something far more momentous than a single night's shelter. "One night," he agreed, "and whatever comes after, that choice will be yours to make." Inga woke to the sound of wood being split outside, each blow of the axe ringing clear in the crisp morning air. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, disoriented by the warmth surrounding her and the absence of the constant alertness that had become her normal state. The sleeping alcove was exactly as Eirik had promised, private, secure, and blessedly warm from the fire that had burned all night. The horsehair blanket draped across the foot of the bed had been her salvation during the dark hours. Woven with intricate patterns that spoke of skilled hands and careful planning, it held warmth like nothing she'd experienced since childhood. She traced the geometric designs with her fingertips before sleep claimed her, marveling at the craftsmanship while trying not to think about the hands that had created such beauty. Sunlight filtered through the small window above her sleeping space, painting golden rectangles across the wooden floor. Real sunlight, not the filtered grey she'd grown accustomed to during her weeks of travel. The luxury of waking naturally, without the urgent need to move or hide, felt almost decadent. The iron bolts she'd drawn the night before remained secure, exactly as she'd left them. No one had tried to enter. No footsteps had approached during the night. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she had slept without dreams of fire and screaming. The axe blows stopped, followed by the sound of wood being stacked. Eirik was already about his morning work, maintaining the rhythm of a life that continued regardless of unexpected guests. The realization brought a mixture of relief and something that might have been disappointment. She had expected demands, obligations, some proof that his kindness came with hidden costs. Instead, he simply carried on as if her presence changed nothing fundamental about his daily routine. Her stomach reminded her that one good meal, no matter how filling, couldn't undo weeks of irregular eating. The hunger was gentler now, manageable rather than desperate, but still present enough to drive her from the warmth of the alcove. She found Eirik in the kitchen area, stirring something that smelled of oats and honey. He looked up as she emerged, noting her careful movements and the way she kept the wall at her back. "Sleep well?" he asked, the question casual but his eyes sharp enough to catch any signs of distress. "Yes," she replied, surprised by how true it was. "Better than I have in a long time." He nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Food's nearly ready. There's water for washing by the basin there if you'd like." The luxury of warm water for washing seemed almost sinful after so many days of cold streams and hasty cleanings. Inga approached the basin cautiously, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. The water was indeed warm, heated over the fire and scented with something that reminded her of her mother's herb garden. She caught a reflection in the polished metal mirror above the basin and barely recognized the person staring back. Her face was gaunt, marked by exhaustion and stress, her hair hanging in tangled strands that hadn't seen proper care in weeks. The girl who'd fled her burning village was gone, replaced by someone harder and more watchful. "There are combs and such in the wooden box there," Eirik said without looking up from his cooking. "Help yourself to whatever you need." The wooden box contained treasures she'd almost forgotten existed, bone combs, scented soaps, even ribbons for binding hair. All women's things, carefully maintained and ready for use. She thought of the 7 women he'd mentioned, wondered what their stories had been and whether they'd stood at this same basin, marveling at the simple luxury of being clean. By the time she'd washed her face and managed to tame her hair into something resembling order, breakfast was ready. Eirik served her a bowl of porridge sweetened with honey and studded with dried berries, accompanied by bread that was still warm from the morning baking. "You made this today?" she asked, inhaling the yeasty scent that spoke of early rising and careful preparation. "Bread's better fresh," he said, as if baking daily loaves was the most natural thing in the world. "I rise early anyway. The horses expect their morning feed, whether I've slept well or poorly." They ate in comfortable silence, the morning light growing stronger as the sun climbed higher. Outside, she could hear the horses moving in their paddocks, the soft sounds of animals content with their lot. It painted a picture of life, lived with purpose and routine, the kind of existence she'd thought was lost to her forever. "The horses," she said eventually. "You breed them?" "Some. Mostly I train them for others who lack the patience or skill." His voice carried quiet pride. Horses are honest creatures. They don't pretend to be something they're not, don't lie about their intentions. A man can learn to trust them in ways that aren't always safe with people. The comment held layers of meaning that weren't lost on her. She'd learned similar lessons about trust, though from a different perspective, where his experience had taught him to value the honesty of animals. Hers had taught her to doubt the motives of anyone who offered help. "Could I—" she began, then stopped, unsure whether she had the right to ask favors. "Could I see them?" "The horses?" Something shifted in Eirik's expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "You like horses?" "My father bred them," she said, the words coming easier than expected. Before everything happened, I used to help with the foals, the gentle ones that needed patience more than strength." "Then you understand their nature," he said, rising from the table. "Come, I'll introduce you to the herd." The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the sense of grass and wood smoke and the indefinable freshness that spoke of land well cared for. The horses lifted their heads as Eirik approached, several moving toward the fence with the easy confidence of animals who knew themselves welcome. "This is Storm," he said, indicating the black stallion she'd seen him with the previous evening. Proud as a king and twice as stubborn but honest in his way, the stallion's eyes were intelligent, assessing. He studied Inga with the same careful attention she was giving him, neither hostile nor immediately welcoming. When she extended her hand slowly, palm up, he stretched his neck to investigate her scent. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "Strong but not cruel. Strength without cruelty," Eirik repeated thoughtfully. "That's a rare combination in any species." Storm decided she passed whatever test he'd been conducting and allowed her to touch his neck, his coat warm and smooth under her fingers. The contact sent something through her that she'd almost forgotten, the simple pleasure of connection with another living creature, uncomplicated by fear or hidden agendas. "You have his trust," Eirik observed. "That doesn't happen quickly with Storm. He's particular about who he allows close." "Animals know things," Inga said, watching the stallion's ears flick forward with interest. "They can sense what people really are underneath the words and promises. What do you think Storm senses about you?" She considered the question seriously, studying the horse's calm acceptance of her presence. "Someone who understands what it means to be careful. Someone who won't take trust for granted." Eirik's smile was small but genuine. "I think you're right. And what do you sense about him?" "Strength that protects rather than dominates," she said without hesitation. "Power held in check by choice, not fear." The horsehair blanket made sense now, seeing the care with which these animals were tended. Every strand would have been gathered with respect, woven with the knowledge that it came from creatures valued for more than their utility. It represented a philosophy of life that she was only beginning to understand. The idea that strength and gentleness could coexist, that protection could be offered without demands for submission in return. 3 days passed before Inga realized she'd stopped planning her departure. The recognition came as she stood in Eirik's workshop, watching him repair a broken bridle with the same methodical patience he brought to everything else. Her traveling pack sat in the corner of the sleeping alcove, still ready for flight, but she hadn't touched it since that first morning. The leather-bound journal on his workbench drew her attention again. She'd noticed it the day before, but hadn't asked about it, respecting the privacy that he'd extended to her without question. Today, however, curiosity overcame her natural caution. "You write?" she asked, nodding toward the journal while continuing to sort the leather scraps he'd asked her to organize by size and quality. Eirik glanced up from the bridle, following her gaze. "I keep records. Horse bloodlines, training notes, weather patterns. Nothing particularly interesting, but the way he said it suggested there was more to it than simple record-keeping. The journal was too well made for mundane notes, its leather cover worn smooth by frequent handling. This was something touched daily, something important enough to warrant care in its creation and maintenance. "My mother kept journals," Inga said, returning to her sorting. "Stories mostly. Old tales from her grandmother, new ones she made up for me when I was small. She said stories were how people remembered what mattered most, What kind of stories? There was genuine interest in his voice, the kind that invited sharing without demanding it. Adventures, mostly. Brave women who saved kingdoms and found love with men who deserved them. Happy endings where kindness was rewarded and cruelty was punished. She paused, a piece of particularly fine leather soft between her fingers. I used to believe the world worked that way. Perhaps it does sometimes. Eirik set down his tools and looked at her directly. You're here, aren't you? Safe and fed and warm. That seems like kindness being rewarded. But for how long? The question slipped out before she could stop it, revealing more of her internal struggle than she'd intended. Nothing good lasts. I've learned that much. Nothing bad lasts either, he replied quietly. Both good and ill have their seasons. The skill is in recognizing which season you're in and acting accordingly. He opened the journal to a page near the middle, studying something written there. Would you like to know what this really is? Inga nodded, curious despite herself. Letters, he said, to Astrid. Things I should have told her while she lived. Thoughts I wish I could share with her now. Promises about the life I'm building in her memory. The admission was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that Inga stopped her sorting entirely. She'd assumed this scarred warrior had made his peace with grief, had found some way to move beyond the pain of loss. To learn that he still carried such raw emotion, still needed ways to connect with what was gone. It made him seem more human somehow, less like the unshakable protector he appeared to be. Does it help? She asked. Writing to her? Some days. He closed the journal carefully, handling it with the reverence others might reserve for sacred texts. It reminds me why I choose to keep my oath, even when solitude seems easier than caring for strangers who might leave without warning. The comment carried weight, but not accusation. He was simply stating a truth they both understood, that she would leave eventually, that attachments formed here were temporary by their very nature. I don't know how to stay anywhere, she admitted. Every place I've been since the fire, it feels like I'm just waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. Like I'm a curse that brings destruction wherever I go. Eirik was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. I used to think the same thing, he said. After Astrid died, after I failed to protect what mattered most, I believed I was meant to be alone, that anyone who got close to me would suffer for it. What changed your mind? The first woman who came here? Maya, her name was. She'd been traveling for months, running from a husband who beat her bloody every time the mood struck him. She was pregnant, barely showing, but sick with worry about bringing a child into such a world. He moved to the window, looking out at the horse paddocks, where the afternoon light painted everything in shades of gold. She stayed through the winter, helped with the horses, learned to weave the horsehair blankets. When spring came, she was strong enough to travel on, but she'd decided she wanted to stay. Made this place her home for nearly 2 years. What happened to her? She met a merchant who traveled the trading routes between settlements. Good man, patient and kind. They fell in love the way people do when they're both ready for it. Slowly, carefully, with respect for what each had survived. When they married, I gave them horses as a wedding gift and wished them well on their journey. Inga tried to imagine such an ending, such a gentle transition from survival to something resembling happiness. It seemed like something from one of her mother's stories, too perfect to exist in the real world. Do you ever hear from her? Every spring, when the trading routes open again, letters telling me about her life, her children, the home they've built together. She always signs them with gratitude for the time to heal. The phrase resonated in ways Inga wasn't prepared for. Time to heal. When had she last believed such a thing was possible? When had she stopped thinking of wounds as permanent, of damage as irreversible? She wasn't a curse, Eirik continued. She was just someone who needed a safe place to discover who she could become when fear wasn't driving every decision. Just like you're not a curse, Inga Frostborn. You're someone who survived terrible things and is still looking for reasons to hope. Hope feels dangerous, she said quietly. Hope is what gets you hurt when everything falls apart again. Fear is what gets you hurt," he countered gently. "Fear keeps you running when you might find rest, keeps you alone when you might find companionship. Hope is what lets you recognize sanctuary when you stumble across it." That evening, as they shared another meal by the fire, Inga found herself paying attention to details she'd tried to ignore before. The way Eirik's eyes crinkled slightly when he was amused by something she said. The careful way he moved around her, never crowding, never making sudden gestures that might startle her into flight. The patience with which he answered her questions about the horses, the land, the rhythms of this life he'd built. He was courting her trust. She realized, not through grand gestures or pretty words, but through the steady accumulation of small kindnesses. Each meal shared, each comfortable silence, each moment when he could have demanded something from her but chose not to. They were all building toward something she wasn't ready to name. That night, for the first time since arriving, she didn't pack her few belongings before sleeping. The traveling bag remained in the corner, ready if needed, but no longer the focus of her evening routine. It was a small change, barely noticeable, but it felt like the first crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. Outside, the wind carried the promise of coming winter, but inside the longhouse, warmth held dominion. The horsehair blanket wrapped around her like an embrace, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Inga fell asleep without calculating the fastest route to the door. A week into her stay, Inga discovered the silver arm ring hidden beneath her sleeping furs. The delicate piece of jewelry was clearly ancient, inscribed with runes that spoke of protection and safe journeys. It had belonged to someone important, someone beloved enough to warrant such careful craftsmanship and precious metal. She found Eirik in the paddock, working with a young mare, his movements fluid and patient as he guided the animal through basic commands. The sight had become familiar over the past days, but she still marveled at how someone so large could move with such gentle precision. "I found this," she said, holding up the arm ring when he paused in his work. "In the sleeping alcove. I didn't want you to think I was taking things that weren't mine." Eirik's expression grew thoughtful as he recognized the piece. "That was Astrid's," he said quietly. "I'd wondered where it had gotten to." "It's beautiful," Inga said, studying the intricate knotwork that seemed to shift and flow in the afternoon light. "The runes, they're for protection. Protection and safe travels. Our grandmother gave it to Astrid on her 16th birthday, said it had been in our family for generations." He secured the mare and walked over to where Inga stood. "She was wearing it the day she was taken. Found it later, dropped on the trail where they'd grabbed her. The weight of that history settled between them." Inga tried to hand the ring back, but Eirik made no move to take it. "Keep it," he said. "Astrid would have wanted someone to wear it who understood its purpose." "I can't," Inga protested. "It's too precious, too important to your family." "You are under my protection," Eirik replied with quiet certainty. "That makes you family in the ways that matter. The ring belongs with someone who needs its blessing." The words hit her with unexpected force. Family? She'd thought that concept was lost to her forever, burned away with everything else she'd once held dear. The idea that it could be rebuilt, chosen rather than inherited, seemed almost too good to be true. "What if I leave?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger each day as comfort made departure seem both less necessary and more difficult. "What if I take it and never come back?" "Then it will have served its purpose," he said simply. "Protection and safe travels. That's what the runes promise, not eternal presence in one place." That afternoon, she wore the arm ring while helping Eirik move hay from the storage loft to the paddocks. The silver warmed against her skin, and she found herself touching it frequently, reassured by its weight and the history it carried. For the first time since fleeing her home, she felt connected to something larger than her own survival. The work was harder than she'd expected. Weeks of irregular eating and constant travel had left her weaker than she wanted to admit, and muscles unused to sustained effort protested loudly. But there was satisfaction in the labor, a sense of contributing rather than simply accepting charity. "You don't have to do this," Eirik said as he noticed her struggling with a particularly heavy bale. Rest is part of healing. I need to do something, she replied, accepting his help, but not abandoning the task entirely. I can't just take without giving anything back. It doesn't feel right. You give more than you know, he said, lifting the bale as if it weighed nothing. Company, conversation, someone to share meals with. I'd forgotten how empty this place felt when the only voices were my own and the horses. The admission surprised her. She'd assumed he preferred solitude, that her presence was a duty he accepted rather than something he actively enjoyed. The possibility that she brought him something of value, rather than being purely a burden to be tolerated, was almost too much to process. They worked in comfortable rhythm as the afternoon wore on, falling into the kind of easy cooperation that develops between people who've learned to read each other's movements and intentions. When her strength finally gave out completely, Eirik called a halt without making her feel weak or useless. Enough for today, he said, settling beside her on a pile of loose hay. The rest can wait until tomorrow. The view from the loft showed the full scope of his domain, paddocks stretching toward the tree line, gardens laid out with mathematical precision, everything arranged with the eye of someone who planned for the long term. It was a life built to last, to weather whatever storms might come. You've built something beautiful here, Inga said, genuinely meaning it. It feels permanent, like it will outlast whatever troubles might come. That's the hope, Eirik replied. After Astrid died, I needed to create something that would honor her memory, something that would stand as proof that beauty could survive ugliness, that kindness could triumph over cruelty. Do you think she would approve of what you've done here, the women you've helped? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. I think she would understand the necessity, he said finally. Astrid always saw the best in people, always believed that everyone deserved a second chance at happiness. This place, it's my way of continuing that belief, even when it's difficult, when people leave without warning or fail to appreciate what you've given them. Especially then, he said with quiet conviction. Love isn't measured by what you receive in return. It's measured by what you're willing to give when receiving nothing is guaranteed. The words resonated with something deep in Inga's chest, a longing she'd tried to bury beneath layers of practical concern and self-protection. She'd spent so long focused on survival that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be cared for without condition, to be valued for more than her utility. I don't know how to do this, she admitted quietly. How to accept kindness without waiting for the other shoe to drop. How to trust that good things can last, one day at a time, Eirik said. One choice at a time. You don't have to commit to forever, just to right now, this moment, this breath. The silver arm ring caught the light as she moved, its runes seeming to pulse with ancient promise. Protection and safe travels, but perhaps also the wisdom to know when the journey could pause, when safety could be more than temporary shelter. As evening approached and they climbed down from the loft, Inga realized that something fundamental had shifted during their conversation. The traveling pack in her alcove no longer called to her with quite the same urgency. The door no longer seemed like the most important feature of every room. For the first time since arriving, she was beginning to think in terms of weeks rather than days, to consider what it might mean to truly rest rather than simply pause between flights. The change terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that the leap might lead to flight rather than falling. The carved bone hair comb became Inga's daily ritual, though she hadn't intended it that way. Each morning, she found herself reaching for the delicate piece with its intricate knotwork patterns, working it through her hair with the same careful attention Eirik brought to his horses. The comb was another remnant from his collection of women's things, worn smooth by many hands, but still beautiful in its simple functionality. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival, and the rhythms of life on the homestead had begun to feel natural rather than foreign. She woke with the sun, helped with morning chores, shared meals that had become conversations rather than silent necessities. The constant vigilance that had defined her existence was slowly giving way to something that might have been called peace. But peace, She was learning, came with its own challenges. "You're thinking too hard again," Eirik observed as they worked together in the garden, harvesting the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze. "I can practically hear the wheels turning from here." Inga looked up from the turnip she'd been attacking with unnecessary vigor, realizing he was right. Her mind had been churning for days, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. "I've been here 2 weeks," she said, settling back on her heels. "Longer than I've stayed anywhere since everything happened. I keep waiting for it to feel wrong, for the voice in my head to start screaming that it's time to run, but it hasn't. That's the problem," she admitted. "It feels right. Too right. Like I could forget why I was running in the first place." Eirik continued his methodical harvesting, giving her words the consideration they deserved before responding. "Would that be such a terrible thing? Forgetting the fear long enough to remember who you were before it claimed you? What if I was no one before the fear?" The question had been haunting her for days. What if running and hiding is all I know how to do anymore? What if I've forgotten how to be anything else? "You help with the horses," he pointed out. "You've mended 3 bridles this week, organized my entire workshop, and convinced that stubborn grey mare to accept a halter for the first time since I bought her. That doesn't sound like someone who only knows how to run." The grey mare had been a particular triumph. The animal had arrived wild and untrusting, refusing human contact with a desperation that Inga recognized all too well. But patience and gentle persistence had won out, just as they seemed to be winning with her own gradual healing. "The mare was different," Inga said. "She needed someone who understood what it felt like to be afraid all the time. I could help her because I'd been where she was, and now—" Eirik's question was gentle but pointed. "Are you still in that same place?" Inga considered the question honestly. The constant tension that had lived in her shoulders for weeks was mostly gone. She slept through the night more often than not. The sound of unexpected footsteps no longer sent her heart racing with panic. Even her appetite had returned, her body finally believing that food would be available tomorrow and the day after that. "I don't know," she said finally. "Sometimes I feel like I'm healing, like I could build something here. But then I remember that every good thing I've ever had was taken away, and I wonder if I'm just setting myself up for worse pain when this ends too." "When?" Eirik repeated thoughtfully. "Not if." The distinction hit her like a physical blow because it revealed the assumption she hadn't even realized she was making. Despite the comfort, despite the growing sense of belonging, she was still thinking in terms of inevitable departure, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Everything ends," she said defensively. "People leave or die or change their minds about wanting you around. Better to leave first, on your own terms, than to wait for the rejection. Is that what happened with your family? They left you?" The question was so unexpected, so far from her actual experience, that Inga nearly laughed. "No," she said. "They died protecting me. They died because raiders wanted our horses and didn't care how many people they had to kill to get them. So the people who loved you never chose to leave," Eirik said quietly. "They were taken from you by violence and circumstance. Not the same thing as voluntary abandonment." The insight struck her silent. She'd been so focused on the pain of loss that she'd conflated being left with being abandoned. Had assumed that all endings were rejections rather than tragedies beyond anyone's control. "I hadn't thought of it that way," she admitted. "Fear has a way of rewriting history," he said, "making every loss feel like proof that we're unworthy of love. When sometimes loss is just the price of living in a world where terrible things happen to good people." They worked in silence for a while, the autumn air crisp with the promise of coming winter. Around them, the homestead hummed with quiet activity, horses moving in their paddocks, the wind through the trees, the distant sound of wood settling as buildings adjusted to the changing temperature. "Maya," Inga said eventually. "The first woman who stayed here, did she struggle with the same fears?" "For months," Eirik confirmed. She'd been married to a man who convinced her that she was worthless, that no one could ever want her except him. Even after she was safe, even after her bruises healed, she carried those words like poison in her blood. How did she get past it? Time, mostly. And the patience to let herself be proven wrong one day at a time. She'd test me, push boundaries, wait for me to show my true nature, expect me to demand payment for my kindness. When I didn't, when I just kept being exactly who I'd said I was, she slowly began to believe that maybe her husband had been lying about her worth. And the merchant, the man she married, he loved her scars, Eirik said with a small smile. Not in spite of them, but because they were part of her story. He said they proved her strength, her will to survive, made her more beautiful, not less. The concept was so foreign to Inga's understanding that she struggled to process it. In her experience, damage made you less valuable, not more. Scars were evidence of weakness, proof that you'd failed to protect yourself adequately. I have scars, she said quietly, touching the silver arm ring through her sleeve. Not all of them visible. I know, Eirik replied. So do I. Maybe that's why we understand each other so well. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing the day's last meal, Inga found herself studying Eirik's face in the flickering light. The battle scars that marked his arms and hands told stories of violence survived, choices made under pressure, a life lived on the edge of danger. But his eyes held something else entirely. Kindness seasoned with wisdom, strength tempered by compassion. Can I ask you something? She said, gathering courage for a question that had been building for days. Always. Do you ever regret it? This life you've chosen? Taking in broken strangers and putting their healing ahead of your own comfort? Eirik was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Never, he said. This life, it's given me more purpose than I ever found in battle. More peace than I ever thought possible after losing Astrid. Every woman who's found healing here has healed something in me as well. The bone comb lay on the table between them, its carved surface catching the firelight. Tomorrow she would use it again. Working through her hair with the same patient care that was slowly working through the tangles in her heart. The bronze shield hanging above the hearth had always seemed purely decorative to Inga, a relic from Eirik's warrior past that served now as nothing more than a reminder of battles long finished. Its surface bore the marks of countless conflicts, dents from axes, scratches from sword blades, the patina of age and use. She'd grown accustomed to its presence, barely noticing it as she went about her daily routines, until the morning she recognized the clan markings etched around its rim. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and she was helping Eirik repair harness leather when the morning light struck the shield at just the right angle, illuminating symbols she'd seen before, but never truly examined. The serpent coiled around a lightning bolt, the 3 interlocked circles beneath crossed spears. They were as familiar to her as her own name. Her hands stilled on the leather she'd been mending, her breath catching in her throat as memory crashed over her like a physical blow. Those markings belonged to the Bloodaxe clan, the raiders who had swept down from the northern wastes and destroyed everything she'd ever known. The same men who had killed her parents, burned her village, sent her fleeing into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's wooden cross. Inga. Eirik's voice seemed to come from very far away. What's wrong? She couldn't speak, couldn't form words around the sudden understanding that had crystallized in her mind. The shield wasn't just a trophy from random battles. It was specific, personal. A prize taken from enemies who had been very real, very particular people. The shield, she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Where did you get it? Eirik followed her gaze to the bronze disc above the fire, his expression growing wary as he registered the change in her demeanor. From a raid, he said carefully. Why? What kind of raid? The question came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with a desperation she couldn't control. Who did you take it from? Inga, tell me. The words erupted from her with enough force to make him step back, clearly recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in the room. Those markings, I know those markings. The Bloodaxe clan? You fought the Bloodaxe clan. Eric's face went very still, the kind of stillness that preceded either violence or terrible revelations. "Yes," he said quietly. "I fought them." "When?" Her hands were shaking now, the leather dropping forgotten to the floor. "When did you fight them?" 3 months ago, he replied, and she could see him beginning to understand why she was asking, beginning to piece together connections he hadn't wanted to make. There was a village, they'd raided it, taken captives. We tracked them for days before we caught up. The world seemed to tilt around her as the implications crashed home. 3 months ago. The timing was perfect, horrible in its precision. 3 months ago was when her world had ended, when the Blood Axe raiders had descended on her village like a plague of locusts, taking everything that wasn't nailed down and burning the rest. "The village," she said, her voice hollow. What village? But she already knew. Could see the knowledge in his eyes, the recognition that was dawning as the pieces fell into place. The broken girl who'd appeared at his door, the timing of her flight, the way she'd carried herself like someone fleeing from recent trauma. It all made terrible sense now. "Ironhold," he said quietly. The village was called Ironhold. Her legs gave out, depositing her heavily on a nearby stool as the full weight of understanding settled over her. Ironhold, her village, her home, the place where her parents had died protecting horses that had ultimately been taken anyway, where her friends and neighbors had been slaughtered or captured by men whose shield now hung in her place of refuge. "You were there," she said, the words feeling strange and distant, as if someone else was speaking them. "You saw what they did." "We were too late to save the village," Eirik said, his voice careful and measured. "By the time we arrived, the raiders had already done their work. We followed them, caught up with them at their camp. There was a battle, and you won. It wasn't a question." The shield above the fire was proof enough of victory. "Yes," he confirmed. "We won. Most of the raiders died. A few escaped into the deep woods, but we recovered what captives we could." Captives. The word hit her like a slap. There had been captives. People from her village who had been taken alive, who might have been saved if she'd known, if she'd stayed to fight instead of running like a coward into the wilderness. "How many?" she asked, afraid of the answer, but needing to know. "How many did you save?" 12, Eirik said quietly. "Mostly women and children, some of the younger men who'd been taken for slave labor. 12 people, 12 lives that had been saved while she ran through the forest, thinking herself the only survivor. 12 neighbors and friends who had been returned to whatever was left of their lives while she wallowed in guilt and self-pity, believing herself cursed and alone. Where are they now?" she asked. "The ones you saved, resettled. There's a trading post 2 days' ride south. They've started new lives there. The village headman arranged for them to be taken in, given work and shelter while they rebuild." She closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what she was learning. All this time, she'd been running from ghosts, believing herself the sole survivor of a tragedy that had claimed everyone she'd ever known. But they weren't all dead. Some had lived, had been rescued, had found new homes and new purposes. Did they? She started, then stopped, afraid to ask the question that mattered most. Did they ask about others? About people who might have escaped? Eirik's expression grew infinitely gentle, as if he understood exactly what she was really asking. "They did. We searched the ruins, looked for survivors or signs of escape, found evidence that at least one person had fled on foot, but the trail was cold by the time we arrived. We all hoped, that whoever it was had made it to safety. You were looking for me," she realized. "Without knowing who I was or that I existed, you were looking for me. We were looking for anyone who might have survived," he corrected gently. "Anyone who might need help." The irony was almost too much to bear. While she'd been stumbling through the wilderness, convinced that she was cursed and alone, the very man who had avenged her family's death had been searching for survivors. The shield that now seemed to mock her from its place of honor had been taken from the men who'd destroyed her world, claimed in battle by someone who'd fought to undo their damage. "The cross," she said suddenly, pulling her father's wooden pendant from beneath her shirt. "My father made this. Would the people you saved, would they recognize it? Eirik studied the simple carved piece with new understanding. Olav Frostborn, he said quietly. The horse breeder. Yes, they would recognize it. They spoke of him, said he died defending the stables, trying to save the animals, even when the situation was hopeless. Fresh tears came then, the first she'd shed since that terrible night. Not tears of despair, but of something more complex, grief mixed with pride, loss tempered by the knowledge that her father's sacrifice had been witnessed and remembered. He always said the horses were his responsibility, she managed through her tears. That a man's worth was measured by how well he cared for what was entrusted to him. He was right, Eirik said simply. And you're his daughter. That makes you part of a story of courage, not cowardice. The bronze shield caught the morning light again, but now it looked different to her eyes. Not a trophy taken from random enemies, but justice made manifest. Proof that evil actions had consequences, that someone had cared enough to pursue the raiders and make them pay for what they'd done. All this time, she whispered, I thought I was running from my past. But I was running toward it instead, running toward the very person who'd already fought my battles for me. Not for you, Eirik corrected gently. With you. The battle isn't finished until you decide what comes next. Until you choose whether to keep running or start building something new from what remains. The shield would always hang above the hearth, she realized. But now it would serve a different purpose, not as a reminder of past violence, but as proof that justice could exist, that good people sometimes won. That the story didn't always end with the villains riding away unopposed. The question now was what story she would choose to write next. The iron forge hammer in Eirik's workshop had remained cold for weeks, its purpose purely decorative since Inga's arrival. But now, as she processed the earth-shaking revelation about the bronze shield and her connection to this place, she found herself drawn to its solid weight and the promise of creation it represented. For the first time since learning the truth, she felt ready to build rather than simply survive. 3 days had passed since the discovery, 3 days of careful conversations and gradual acceptance of a reality that reframed everything she thought she knew about her story. The initial shock had given way to something more complex, a mixture of grief and relief, anger and gratitude, all swirling together in ways that defied easy categorization. You don't have to decide anything today, Eirik said as they worked together in the forge, heating metal for repairs to the winter equipment. Or tomorrow, or next week. The choice is yours to make when you're ready to make it. But Inga was beginning to understand that she'd already made the choice, had been making it in small increments every day since her arrival. The traveling pack that had once dominated her thoughts now gathered dust in the corner of the sleeping alcove. The bone comb had become a daily ritual rather than a borrowed convenience. The silver arm ring felt like part of her own history rather than a temporary adornment. I've been thinking about what Maya did, she said, working the bellows to keep the flames hot enough for their purpose. How she stayed for 2 years before finding her path forward. Was she happy here? During those years? I believe so, Eirik replied, studying the metal to judge its readiness. She found peace, certainly. Time to remember who she was before fear claimed her. But more than that, she found purpose. What kind of purpose? The horses at first. She had a gift for training them, especially the young ones who needed gentle handling. But also, he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully, she helped other women who came here, shared her experience, offered comfort to those who'd suffered similar traumas, made them feel less alone in their healing. The concept resonated with Inga in ways she wasn't prepared for. The grey mare she'd gentled had responded to her touch precisely because she understood what it felt like to be afraid, to distrust kindness, to expect cruelty from those who claimed to offer help. That shared experience had created a bridge between them that no amount of technical skill could have built. Is that what you see for me? She asked. Staying here, helping others the way you help me? I see whatever you choose to see for yourself, Eirik said carefully. But yes, If that's a path that calls to you, there would be room for it here. There's always room for healing in this place. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of hammer on metal providing a soundtrack for thoughts that were slowly taking shape. The forge fire painted everything in shades of gold and crimson, and Inga found herself thinking about transformation, how raw metal became useful tools, how broken people became whole again, how endings could become beginnings if you had the courage to let them. The people from my village, she said eventually. The ones you saved. I want to see them. Eirik's hammer paused mid-strike. Are you certain? It might be painful seeing them again. Remembering what was lost, but also remembering what was saved, she countered. I've spent months thinking I was the only one left, carrying the weight of being the sole survivor. If that's not true, if there are others who remember the same stories, who knew the same people, maybe that weight doesn't have to be mine alone. The trading post is 2 days' travel, he said slowly. We could make the journey when the weather permits, if you're sure that's what you want. I'm sure, she said, surprised by how true it was. But first I want to be able to tell them something hopeful, something about the future instead of just the past. That evening, as they shared their meal by the fire, Inga found herself looking around the longhouse with new eyes. She'd been seeing it as a temporary shelter, a way station between one catastrophe and the next. But now she was beginning to see it as Eirik did, as a place where broken things could be mended, where safety could be more than just the absence of immediate danger. Tell me about the others, she said. The women who stayed here before me, what were their stories? Eirik settled back in his chair, his expression growing thoughtful. Each one was different, but all were running from something. Violent husbands, souled marriages, villages that had no place for unmarried women. Some stayed days, others months. All left stronger than they arrived, and you never... She hesitated, unsure how to ask the question that had been nagging at her. You never tried to convince any of them to stay permanently? Never hoped for more than just providing sanctuary? Hope and expectation are different things, he said carefully. Did I hope that someday someone might choose to make this place their home? Yes, but I never allowed that hope to influence how I treated the women who came here. Their healing had to come first, before any consideration of what I might want. What do you want? The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. More direct than she'd intended, but no less important for its bluntness. Eirik was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if the flames might hold answers to questions he'd been avoiding. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of honesty that had defined all their interactions. I want someone to share this life with, he said finally. Not because they have nowhere else to go, but because they choose it freely, because they see value in what we could build together. I want conversations that last past necessity, companionship that grows stronger rather than more fragile with time. And love, she asked quietly. Do you want love? I want the kind of love that grows from respect and understanding, he replied. The kind that builds slowly, with full knowledge of each other's scars and strengths. Not the desperate clinging that comes from need, but the steady warmth that comes from genuine choice. Inga touched the silver arm ring through her sleeve, feeling its weight and the promise it represented. Protection and safe travels, but perhaps also the wisdom to know when the traveling could end, when protection could become partnership. I don't know how to be someone's choice, she admitted. I only know how to be someone's obligation or burden. I don't know what I have to offer besides my own healing. You have more than you know, Eirik said gently. Strength that survived what would have broken others. Compassion that extends to frightened animals and lost souls. Skills with horses that come from genuine understanding, not just technical knowledge. And he paused as if debating whether to continue. You have a way of making this place feel like a home, instead of just a shelter. The words hit her with unexpected force, partly because she recognized their truth. Over the past weeks, she had been unconsciously making small changes, organizing the kitchen with an eye toward efficiency, arranging the common areas to encourage conversation, tending the herb garden with the care of someone who expected to be around for the harvest. I've been building without realizing it, she said wonderingly. Making plans for tomorrow and next week instead of just surviving today. Building a life takes practice, Eirik observed. Most people don't realize they're doing it until they look back and see what they've created. That night, Inga lay in the sleeping alcove staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. The iron bolts remained undrawn, not because she'd forgotten them, but because they no longer felt necessary. The fear that had driven her here was transforming into something else, something that looked remarkably like hope. The forge hammer waited in the workshop, ready to shape whatever metal might be placed upon its anvil. Tomorrow, she thought, she would ask Eirik to teach her its use. Not because she needed to know how to work iron, but because she wanted to. Understand how raw materials became something beautiful and useful. How broken things could be remade into something stronger than they'd been before. The bronze shield caught the firelight from its place above the hearth, and for the first time since recognizing its significance, Inga looked at it without pain. It was proof that justice existed, that someone had cared enough to pursue her family's killers and exact payment for their crimes. But more than that, it was evidence that some battles could be won, that good people sometimes triumphed over evil ones. The question now was what battles she was willing to fight for the life she was beginning to imagine for herself. What she was prepared to build, to defend, to choose freely rather than simply accept by default. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming snow. But inside the longhouse, warmth held dominion. Not just the warmth of fire and shelter, but the deeper warmth that came from being known and accepted. From finding a place where healing was possible and hope could take root. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new possibilities. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Inga fell asleep, planning for the future instead of simply surviving the present. The woven horsehair, rope in Inga's hands, represented more than just functional equipment. It was proof of trust earned and skill shared, a tangible connection between her past life and her present choice. She had been working on it for 3 days, learning the ancient technique from Eirik's patient instruction, preparing for the journey that would finally bring her story full circle. They would leave for the trading post at dawn, riding horses she had helped train and carrying supplies she had helped gather. The expedition was her idea, her decision, but Eirik had embraced it as if he'd been waiting for this moment as long as she had. It's strong work, he said, examining the rope with the critical eye of someone who understood that lives often depended on such details. Your father would be proud. This is the mark of someone who learned the craft properly. The praise warmed her in ways she hadn't expected. For weeks, she had been thinking of herself as someone who had lost everything, who had been severed from her past by violence and flight. But the skills remained, embedded in her hands and muscle memory. The knowledge her father had shared with her lived on, ready to be used in service of something new. Will they remember me? She asked, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger as departure approached. It's been months. They might have decided I was dead, moved on from grieving. My return might be unwelcome, a reminder of loss they've worked to forget. They'll remember, Eirik said with quiet certainty. The heart doesn't forget its own, even when the mind tries to protect itself from hope. Besides, he gestured toward the rope in her hands, you're not returning empty-handed. You're bringing skills, knowledge, the promise of connection to someone who understands their loss. And you, she said, meeting his eyes directly, I'm bringing you. The man who saved them, who made their survival possible. Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed to surface. Is that what you want? To present us as a pair, a partnership? The question hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile. Inga realized that her answer would define not just this journey, but everything that came after. The choice she made now would determine whether she was visiting her past as a survivor seeking closure, or as someone who had found a new family and wanted to share that joy with the remnants of her old one. Yes, she said, the word carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. "That's what I want. To introduce you as the man who gave me back my life, who showed me that safety could exist without surrender, that trust could be rebuilt after it was broken. And what am I to you?" he asked gently. "Friend, protector, something more?" The directness of the question might have terrified her weeks ago, but now it felt like a door opening rather than a trap closing. She set down the rope and moved closer to where he sat, close enough to see the hope he was trying to keep, carefully controlled. "You're the person I choose," she said simply. "Not because I have no other options, but because I've learned what it means to be safe, and I want to build something beautiful from that foundation. You're the man I want to share my tomorrows with, if you'll have me." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, nothing like the desperate claiming she had feared from men for so long. It was a question asked and answered, a promise offered and accepted. When they separated, Inga realized that something fundamental had changed in the world around them. The longhouse was no longer a sanctuary she was visiting, but a home she was claiming. "The others," Eirik said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. "When we reach the trading post, they'll see us together and understand what's happened between us. Are you prepared for their questions, their opinions about your choice?" "I'm prepared to be happy," Inga replied. "To let them see that survival can become something more than just endurance. That the girl who ran from the burning village found not just safety, but love." They spent the evening in final preparations, packing supplies and checking equipment with the thoroughness of people who understood that winter travel was not to be undertaken lightly. But beneath the practical concerns ran a current of anticipation that had nothing to do with the journey itself and everything to do with what they would be together. When they returned, the bronze shield caught the firelight as always, but now it seemed like a blessing rather than a reminder of past pain. It was proof that justice existed, that love could triumph over cruelty, that some stories did have the happy endings her mother had written in her journals. As they settled by the fire for their last evening alone, Inga realized that she had finally learned the difference between running toward something and running away from it. Tomorrow's journey would take her back to face her past, but she would be traveling as someone who had claimed her future. The woven rope lay coiled beside their packs, ready to bind whatever needed securing on the road ahead. But the strongest rope was the one that had been growing between them, strand by careful strand, until it was strong enough to hold the weight of two hearts that had chosen to beat in rhythm. The trading post appeared through the morning mist like something from a half-remembered dream, its wooden buildings arranged around a central square where merchants and travelers gathered to conduct business. But for Inga, seated beside Eirik on the wagon bench with the sacred wooden cross pendant visible at her throat, it represented something far more significant than commerce. It was the place where her old life and new life would finally meet. She recognized them before they recognized her. Marta the Weaver, her grey hair now shorter but her hands still moving with the constant motion of someone who worked fibre into thread. Young Bjorn, no longer quite so young, his shoulders broader from whatever labour he'd taken up in this new place. Old Henrik, his beard whiter but his eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had made him the unofficial leader of their small farming community. Inga, Marta's voice carried across the square, high and disbelieving. Inga Frostborn. "Child, is that truly you?" The recognition spread like ripples in a pond, heads turning and voices rising as word passed from person to person. She had expected this moment to be overwhelming, had prepared herself for tears and recriminations, for questions about why she had disappeared when they needed to mourn together. Instead, she found herself surrounded by embraces, by hands that touched her face and shoulders as if to confirm that she was real and whole. The grief was there, certainly. She could see it in their eyes when they looked at her father's cross, could hear it in the way they spoke of those who hadn't survived. But stronger than the grief was relief, joy, the simple gladness of discovering that one more piece of their shattered world had endured. "We searched for you," Henrik said. his weathered hands gripping hers as if afraid she might disappear again. After the warriors found us, after we learned what had happened to our village, we searched everywhere we could think to look. I was in the deep forest, Inga said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Running, hiding, trying to stay alive. I didn't know. I thought I was the only one left. And now? Marta asked, her eyes moving between Inga and Eirik with the sharp perception of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the subtle signs of partnership. You found safety, clearly. Found more than safety, if I'm reading the signs correctly? Inga felt Eirik's presence beside her like an anchor, steadying her as she prepared to speak words that would change everything. I've found home, she said clearly. This is Eirik Wolfmark, the man who led the warriors that saved you. The man who took me in when I had nothing, who showed me that trust could be rebuilt and that love was possible even after losing everything. The silence that followed was profound, but not uncomfortable. She could see them processing the information, understanding dawning in their faces as they realized what she was telling them. The warrior who saved us, Bjorn said slowly, looking at Eirik with new understanding. You tracked the raiders, fought them, brought us out of that nightmare. We did what needed doing, Eirik replied simply. No one should have to endure what you suffered. And now you care for one of our own, Henrik observed, approval clear in his voice. The circle closes itself in ways we couldn't have foreseen. What followed was unlike anything Inga had imagined. Instead of the painful confrontation with loss she had feared, she found herself part of a celebration. Stories were shared, tales of the village as it had been, memories of her parents and the life they had built together, plans for the future that included rather than excluded her. Your father's horses, Marta said as they sat around a table laden with food the community had insisted on sharing. Eirik tells us you've maintained your skill with them, that you're helping train the animals on his homestead. It's what he taught me, Inga said, touching the cross pendant. The knowledge survives even when everything else is lost. Not everything was lost, Henrik corrected gently. You survived. We survived. The raiders are dead, and we're alive to honor those who aren't. That's victory, child. That's justice. As the day wore on, Inga realized that her return was giving the other survivors something they hadn't known they needed. Proof that their scattered community could find ways to reconnect, that the bonds formed in their original village could stretch across distance and time. Her presence with Eirik demonstrated that love could grow from the ashes of loss, that happiness was possible even after tragedy. Will you stay? Marta asked as evening approached. Make your home here with us? No, Inga said, the answer coming without hesitation. My home is with Eirik now, in the place where I learned to heal. But this won't be goodbye forever. We'll visit, stay connected. You're still my family, even if I've found a new way to live. The wooden cross pendant caught the firelight as she spoke, and she realized that her father would approve of the choice she was making. He had always believed that love was worth fighting for, worth building a life around. Tomorrow they would return to the homestead, but they would travel as more than they had been when they arrived, as partners whose love had been witnessed and blessed by the people who mattered most. Spring came early to the homestead that year, arriving with the soft persistence of hope made manifest. Inga stood in the doorway of the longhouse, watching the morning light paint the paddocks in shades of gold and green, while the carved wooden cross pendant rested warm against her throat, no longer a relic of loss, but a bridge between past and future. 6 months had passed since their return from the trading post. 6 months of learning what it meant to build a life with someone rather than simply survive beside them. The winter had been long but gentle, filled with quiet conversations by the fire, shared tasks that had become rituals, and the gradual understanding that love could grow stronger rather than more fragile when tested by proximity and time. The iron forge hammer now bore the marks of her hands as well as Eirik's, and the workshop held tools they had crafted together for purposes that served their shared vision. She had become more than just someone who helped with the horses. She had become a true partner in the enterprise, bringing skills and insights that complemented his own. "Another one coming up the path," Eirik said, joining her in the doorway and nodding toward the distant figure making its way through the morning mist. "Young woman traveling alone. Looks like she's been walking for days." This would be the fourth woman to seek sanctuary since Inga's arrival, each carrying her own story of loss and displacement, each needing the same gift of time and safety that had allowed Inga to rediscover who she could become when fear no longer drove every decision. "I'll prepare the alcove," Inga said. But Eirik caught her hand gently. "We'll prepare it together," he corrected. "That's how we do things now." The simple words carried weight that went far beyond the immediate task. Everything was "we" now, not because either of them had lost their individual identity, but because they had chosen to create something larger than the sum of their separate selves. The bronze shield still hung above the hearth, but it had been joined by other objects that told the story of their joined lives. The horsehair blanket that had first shown her what sanctuary could feel like. The silver arm ring that now symbolized not just protection, but chosen family. The leather-bound journal where Eirik still wrote to Astrid, but now included stories of the life he was building, rather than just the pain of loss. "What's your name?" Inga asked the young woman once they had brought her inside, fed her, and given her the same explanation about safety and choice that had once been offered to her. "Kaya," came the whispered reply. "I've been walking for weeks. Someone told me there was a place, a man who helped women who had nowhere else to go." "There is such a place," Inga confirmed gently. "But it's not just one man anymore. It's a partnership, a home where healing is possible, and time can work its magic on wounds that seem too deep to mend." She showed Kaya to the sleeping alcove, explaining about the locks and the privacy curtain, about the lack of obligations or expectations beyond accepting the gift of safety. But as she spoke, she realized how much her own perspective had changed. She was no longer someone who accepted sanctuary. She was someone who offered it, who understood from experience what it meant to need refuge and what it took to provide it well. That evening, as they sat by the fire with their newest guest safely settled for the night, Inga found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The terrified girl who had begged to sleep in the barn was gone, replaced by someone who could look at frightened strangers and see not burdens to be endured, but opportunities to honor the gift of her own rescue. "Do you ever miss it?" Eirik asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "The simplicity of having only yourself to worry about?" "Never," she replied, surprised by how quickly and certainly the answer came. "I thought I wanted to be alone, thought it was safer that way. But I was just scared of being disappointed again. This," she gestured around the longhouse, taking in the signs of their shared life, the evidence of love lived daily in small acts of care and consideration. "This is what I was meant for. Not the solitude, but the building." "Building what?" "Everything," she said, leaning against his shoulder with the easy intimacy of someone who no longer feared touch. "A home, a life, a place where broken things can be mended. A partnership that proves love doesn't have to be desperate or fragile. It can be steady and strong and chosen fresh every day." The carved wooden cross caught the firelight. Its simple form, a reminder of faith, not just in divine providence, but in the human capacity for healing, for growth, for the courage to try again when everything seems lost. Her father's gift had become her anchor, connecting her to the best parts of who she had been while supporting who she was becoming. Outside, the horses moved in their paddocks with the easy contentment of creatures well cared for, and somewhere in the sleeping alcove, a frightened young woman was learning what it felt like to rest without fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that kindness could be stronger than cruelty. That home could be built anywhere two people were willing to commit to the work of loving each other well. "Tell me again," Inga said softly, settling more comfortably against Eirik's warmth. "The words you said that first night when I asked to sleep in the barn. You'll sleep next to me," he repeated, his voice carrying the same certainty it had held that first evening, but now enriched by all the nights that had followed. "And now?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Now and always," he said simply. "For as long as you choose to stay." "Forever then," she replied, the word no longer frightening but filled with promise. "I choose forever." The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and outside, the spring wind carried the scent of new growth, of possibilities taking root. Sometimes, Inga thought drowsily, the best endings were really beginnings in disguise.